Felt Tips here, and a tutorial today about how to create shiny 3D text in After Effects using the native Raytraced 3D. Well, first of all, you've got to be using CS6 or CC because Raytraced 3D didn't exist until CS6. If you're using one of those, then perfectly doable. It's not entirely intuitive, particularly if you've not worked in 3D stuff before, but if you sort of think about it in a certain way and observe a few little tricks, then it's actually really easy to achieve what you want. First of all, you're going to need a composition that is a Raytraced 3D composition, and when you set it up, just check your options. We'll go for a sort of moderate ray tracing quality of 3 and anti-aliasing filter of box. If you set it much higher, you'll find that everything takes very long if you're not in fast draft mode. We'll come to that in a moment. So I'm just going to make a background first, just so that we've got something to make it look a little bit nice. I'll create a gradient ramp and we'll make it go from sort of dark blue down to a kind of mid cyan type of color, something like that. Let's make a white layer. We'll call this stripes, and I'll just perhaps pop a Venetian blinds on there. Something like that, just to make some stripes, and I'll drop that back to 10 or 15% thereabouts, just so we've got a little bit of aestheticness, just to make things look nice. Next up, we are going to need some text, and we'll just write in the word shony. We'll write in shiny. No? Oh, should we leave it like that? Let's make it all uppercase. And what I'm going to show you is how to make kind of black text. But actually, when you're making black text, we're going to do black and we're going to do white. When you're making black text, as we've already got here, a very good idea to set your RGB levels somewhat above black, so you get a dark grey. And likewise for white, somewhat below white, so you get a light grey for white, a dark grey for black. It'll become apparent why as we go through this tutorial. Make the layer 3D, and once it's 3D, if you're in a ray traced composition, then you'll have some geometry options. And what we're going to do is we're going to give this an extrusion depth of 160 pixels, and we're going to give it a convex bevel of 12. Yep, so we've got quite sort of big fat text there, juicy sort of text going on. Now, I think this is why I get asked these questions, because people kind of do this and then they're like, well, what's going on? Why does my text not really look 3D? I mean, if we switch into fast draft mode, so we can just navigate around a bit quicker, and we rotate it, we can see that it is 3D. Actually, while we're at it, let's just pop the anchor point in the middle of the text somewhere. It's much better if we can kind of rotate on that middle point. Yeah, why is it not looking 3D? You know, I've sort of gone in and I've made it like 3D, but it's not looking 3D. The trick is, you've got to think about 3D objects in the real world, because that's essentially what digital 3D is. It's a simplification, but it's a kind of an imitation about how light and shadow and objects and surfaces work in the real world. And if you got an object in the real world, it's coming up for Christmas, so let's imagine a kind of a Christmas tree bauble, like a red glass bauble, not see-through glass, but it sort of looks metallic. What do you actually see when you look at that? You see a red reflection, distortion of the environment around it. If you took that same bauble and you put it in a windowless room with no lights and you took a photograph of it, what colour would the bauble be? It'd be black. If you put a light on the bauble but the walls of the room were black, or they were not illuminated by the light, same thing, the bauble would reflect its environment. You'd see nothing. If you had a cyan environment, you'd almost see nothing. If the cyan was the exact complement of the red that the bauble reflects, there's no red element in the cyan light or the cyan environment to reflect. You'd have a similar kind of thing. If you took a Christmas present that was wrapped in mid-grey paper and you illuminate that with a yellow light, it's going to look yellow. So you've got to think that an object is really only as good as the light that illuminates it and the environment around it. That's what makes it look like it looks. And until you've got those things in the scene, it's just not going to look 3D. So the first thing you've got to do is to add a light. And we'll just have a neutral light. We'll call it main light, something like that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch out of Fast Draft, because there are a few things that don't show up in Fast Draft. So when you're sort of setting the look, it's a good idea to not be in Fast Draft. Sometimes you're like, hey, where's my shadows? And they're not there because you're in Fast Draft, or the things can look a bit weird. So I'm going to go into two views, and in this view, I will switch into Fast Draft, I guess. And this is so that we can sort of navigate around and we can easily see the relationship of our lights and our object in this 3D space. So I'm just going to shift that up and a little bit over to the right like that. Now let's just check our light is casting shadows. Our text is accepting shadows, I should imagine. That's usually the default, accept shadows. However, it's not casting shadows. And since there's nothing else in the scene casting shadows, it doesn't have any shadows on it. So one of the first things you can change about the look in the lighting is if the text itself casts shadows. If you turn that on, you can see that's off. Let's just zoom in. Oh, not on that one, because that's in Fast Draft. We won't see shadows. But here, we go from off to on. It gets darker. The text starts casting shadows on itself. So we'll leave that on for the time being. Just give ourselves a little bit more screen over here, shall we? Now, we've put a light in the scene, and straight away we can see that we've got something 3D looking now. But generally speaking, if you were a photographer photographing something like this, you wouldn't settle for one light. You'd put a few lights in there. So let's do the same. Let's make another light. We'll make it a kind of bluish coloured light, something like that. We'll leave the intensity like it is. We'll call it blue. Stick it in the scene, and I'm just going to pull it over here just so that it's coming from a sort of different place to our original light. And I'll do another light which will kind of make, let's make this one, we'll call it red. I'll actually make it a sort of warm, salmony, sort of pinky, fleshy type of colour, something like that. And with that one, what we'll do, and you can see actually now that the cyan-y blue of that light and the red of this light are actually combining to make a more or less white light. Red and cyan being complementary colours will add up to make white. But with this light, let's just rotate around there, I'm going to put it pretty much underneath the text like that. So it's just sort of illuminating the underside of the text a little bit and just creating a little bit of fill down here, you might call that. What I'll do is I'll just turn the light up really super high for a second, just so you can kind of get an idea of what it's actually doing. There you go, you can see it's kind of illuminating the underside somewhat. And I like that effect. I think I'll put that on about sort of 400. It's just giving something down here so that we're not just looking at complete shadow. We're getting some surroundings. We're building a kind of environment, don't forget. Now once you've got some lighting in there, and we'll look at this one for our lighting, because this one's not in Fast Draft mode. Fast Draft would look like that. This is our final mode. A little bit speckledy because we've not got the anti-aliasing turned up full, but we can deal with that. Once we've done that, we can then come into the material options. I'll tell you what, before I do that, I am going to add another type of light. I'm going to add an ambient light. We'll call it ambient. And I'll make this one a sort of creamy colour, something like that. Ambients don't cast shadows. Ambients are just there. And what they do is they kind of raise the whole thing. They light everything completely evenly, no shadows. So if I turn off the other lights, you can see the ambient is just doing this. We're not getting any shading from the ambient, but it can just sort of lift the whole thing up a bit. And generally I'd put an ambient quite low in the mix. So just bringing a bit of illumination so we can now see this side a little bit better as well. It's just lifting the whole thing up very slightly. So once we've got that kind of stuff in the scene, let's go and have a look at the material options. The material options basically set how the object gives back the lights that hit it, how they reflect those things back to the camera. I'm not going to cover absolutely everything here. I'm not going to go into metal, and I'm not going to go into transparency or refraction for this tutorial. I'm going to stick with the four basics. Those are ambient, diffuse, specularity, and reflection. So first of all, let's just look at them one at a time. Let's turn the diffuse and the specular and the reflection all to 0. And what we're seeing there is literally just the ambient. So if we turn our ambient back up, you can see that our ambient is having an effect, but the other stuff isn't. If I turn the ambient down here, it's like a multiplier. So the ambient there has 0 effect. At this level, the ambient has a higher effect. I can control it from the light, or I can control it from the object. Let's turn the ambient off for a second, and let's turn the diffuse up to 100. The default is generally 50. With the diffuse, you can see that you get this kind of, well, very diffuse effect, very dull. It's a bit like sort of a piece of clay or a piece of foam or a piece of plastic. And diffuse is a kind of a reflection from the object, but from an object that has a rough surface. It may be kind of rough at a molecular level, but the point is that the light that's being reflected back is being scattered. And that's how you get this very sort of soft effect from a diffuse light. Specular, on the other hand, is quite the opposite. Specular is just the shininess. And you have two settings for specular. You have the intensity itself and the shininess. And the higher the shininess goes up, the smaller the specular highlights, as they're called, become. Specular you can imagine as a sort of like pinpricks of light, the real pinpoints of light on surfaces. Along the edges, these little highlight kind of bits. And also on surfaces, as you turn the shininess down, you can see that the surface is starting to get illuminated here, and as I go further down, the kind of the size of this reflected point is getting bigger. It's kind of spreading out. So the default is 5. I'm actually going to make this a little bit more kind of sheeny shiny by putting it up to 10 or maybe even 15. So we're getting a bit of that, but not too much. Tell you what, let's go with 12, something like that. Okay, that is the specular. Let's turn that off for a moment, and let's turn the reflection intensity up to 100. Nothing happened. Why did we not get anything happening when we turned the reflection up? Well, the problem there is a pretty simple one. Again, it's to do with the environment. When you reflect something, you reflect the environment, and we don't have an environment here. The lights are a little bit different. 3D generally doesn't sort of reflect lights in objects. They don't count as objects, they just count as illumination. So you need to create either other objects in the scene to get reflected, or you create an environment. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use an image that I found online that MrBlueSummers.com has very kindly made available. It's a very simple sort of photo studio with umbrella. I'm just going to drag that into here, and I'm going to right click and set it to environment layer. Now if we have just that layer, let's just zoom out for a second. If we solo that layer, you can see the environment. You can sort of take the environment and you can like rotate it around, something like that. So let's go to about sort of 270, and that should give us something to reflect. Under the options here, you'll see that it appears in reflections is on, or you can have only. It's still there, you just can't see it anymore. And now when we turn our shiny text on, hopefully we'll actually have something to reflect. Let's just come and have a look. We have reflection intensity of 100, and let's just rotate this around a little bit and see. There you go. You can see the reflection moving across the surface there. Now one of the things is with reflection, if you imagine that the ambient and the diffuse are also types of reflection. If I turn the ambient and the diffuse now up to 100, where we have, don't worry about this one, this is fast draft, but where we have a reflection of 100, the ambient and the diffuse, they're not having any effect anymore. And that's because if you imagine, let's take diffuse, that we're talking that's reflected light that because of a rough surface at a molecular level gets scattered. Whereas reflection is like a sharp reflection, that's on a perfectly smooth, polished surface. Well, of course, if the surface is more polished and throwing back a sharp reflection, then it means that it's not rough, and it's not going to be throwing back a diffuse reflection, or at least less of one. And what it means is essentially when you turn the reflection intensity down, you start to get your diffuse coming back in. So if we go all the way down, we get our ambient and our diffuse as we had before. Let's get those to, oh, and incidentally, let's just turn the reflection intensity back up to 100. That doesn't affect specular. Specular acts as well as the reflection, because I guess specular is a kind of a sharp reflection too. So let's leave our specular at about 100. Well, let's leave it at 100. Let us put our ambient to something like 40 is good, I think. The diffuse to 50. And we'll leave the reflection at 50 as well, so that we're getting a mixture. Maybe even we'll go to 60 on the reflection. So we're getting a mixture of a harder reflection and a more diffuse thing. Now what you can also do, actually, if I just turn the reflection back up for a second and just turn the specular down, another thing you can do with the reflection is make the reflection less sharp. You can actually add a diffusion level to the reflection itself. It tends to be rather processor intensive. So on this particular occasion, I'm just going to leave the reflection sharp. I may just bring it down a shade just so that we don't see the low resolutionness of the layer that we're reflecting. And then back down to, what was it, 60 that we had, the specular up to 100. And in essence, there we have shiny text in After Effects. Right, one last thing. I'm going to actually make a two-stage text. And what that means is I'm going to make a sort of an inner text, which is a different colour. We're going to make a white text, essentially. And we're going to put it inside the black text, so we've got this sort of stepped effect. So what I'll do is I'll make a second one, and I'll parent it to the first one. We can even put just put inner here, so we can distinguish it. I'll turn the other one off for the moment. And just first of all, on the old geometry, we probably want to have a bevel of about 2, just to make it rather kind of smaller. We will put our extrusion depth to 180, and you can see that it just extrudes at the back. So what we then also need to do is just to move that text in Z to compensate. In fact, it should just go forward like that. Because we extruded an extra 20, we move it forward 10, and it should, if I haven't miscalculated, stick out at the front and the back. We'll see. But what I'm going to do is, as I suggested before, I'm going to make a white text that's maybe somewhere around 200, like that. Or we could even just go the same. We could do 225. That would be the same distance from the top as the black text is from the bottom. You can see that's kind of overexposing, but we can actually arrange that a little bit more inside the material options. So what I'll do in the material options first up is just come along and I'll turn the ambient and the diffuse both down, and that should just make it a little bit less kind of full on, although we're then getting somewhat dark on the sides. So perhaps it's better actually if I leave those two up a little bit and actually bring down the specular intensity quite a lot. Something like that. And even the reflection I will be inclined to bring right down. Let's leave it there where it was. I like the effect that the reflection was having on the diffuse. So in actual fact, let us go down like we said before. And our white would look something like that. I'm tempted to go down just a touch further, so we're not getting this kind of overexposedness here. Once again, you can see the fine balance that's going on here. That I'm trying to get the text sort of overall white, but not so white that we can't see the detail on it. White text is actually quite difficult. Let's just take the specular intensity right down to about 15. And let's take the reflection down to pretty much 0. Tell you what, we'll leave a little bit of reflection. And then we'll just try and do the rest with the ambient and the diffuse. Now the ambient's very even and we kind of want evenness, so perhaps it's a good idea to turn the ambient up a bit and the diffuse down a little bit, something like that. Hello, I mistyped. Something along those lines. That's feeling a little bit better. We could even go just up a touch more, maybe not. Tell you what, it's time to turn on the surrounding text and see. Oh, that doesn't look too bad actually. That looks pretty good. A little bit on the glossy side. Let's just perhaps go up a nice little nudge on the old ambient. You can see that's making the whiteness of it feel a bit more sort of uniform. We'll go down just a little bit on the... there we go. That's kind of... That's working all right, actually. We can come down on the old specular intensity a bit because we are seeing these kind of edges there. That's good. If anything, it's feeling a little bit dull, a little bit too grey. Let's turn the ambient up to 100. See how that feels. That feels pretty good. It feels like that the inner text is kind of plasticky compared to the sort of outer text, which should be a bit more shiny. The outer text, of course, is a little less shiny because we're dealing with a much softer bevel. You could actually work around that a little bit more, but that gives you the basic kind of principle of what we're trying to achieve here. And what I'll do is, just for a final view of it, we'll come in and we'll turn the old ray tracing quality up to something like 6. We'll put it onto cubic, and that should give us a little bit of a weight, of course, a slightly less kind of granular type of view of the whole thing. There we go. One last little aesthetic intervention. I'll make a white layer called spots. I'll solo that layer, and I just think this might help it a little bit. I'll just create a few sort of just flat white dots around. I think it might look quite cool if I put a little one in there and another little one down there. I don't know, something like that. Let's see if that does anything. Obviously, it would need to be behind our text as well, I think. There you go, shiny 3D text in After Effects. Let's blow that up a bit. There you go, big text. My name's Felt Tips. Thanks for listening. See you next time.